Hi there, welcome. My name's Travis. I'm making a retro-styled survival horror game called The Revanchist, inspired by classics like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. I've been working on it for a few months now and it's come a long way, but I've never really talked about the story or any bigger picture topics about the game, so that's what we're gonna do today. But first, some good news. The prototype is up and running. I've still got a lot of placeholder content, some rough edges every here and there, but it's pretty much ready to start playtesting. If you're interested in getting in on that, I've got a link in the description to a Discord. I'll be talking a little bit about this later on in the video, so stay tuned for that. So before we get into it, word of warning, this is going to be a little bit different from my normal videos. No script, very light editing, just a nice, chill video talking a bit about the game's story, setting, its history, and some of my plans for it long term, and a little bit of a peek behind the scenes. So pull up a seat, grab a drink, let's get into it. So if you watch my previous videos, you might know The Revanchist didn't start recently. It's actually been in the works for a very long time. And the very earliest version is all the way back from 2012, 2013, something like that. So that's actually what you're seeing on screen right now. At this point, it's totally unrelated. Absolutely nothing from this version of the project is left over in The Revanchist, but this is the initial game that kind of evolved into what you're seeing today. So this was made all the way back on the Unreal Development Kit. Before Unreal Engine is something that was accessible to the general public, you got Unreal Development Kit. Kind of a stripped down, closed source version of Unreal Engine 3. And when I got my hands on this, I decided, you know what? I want to make something scary. Because I've been making games in some way, shape, or form ever since I was 9 years old. I think 9? Yeah, 9 years old. Usually just screwing around in Game Maker, making little projects for myself. Nothing that I ever intended on actually releasing, much less even showing anyone. Just for me, just to have fun making them, basically. As we start getting towards 2010, 2011, I got into 3D graphics. I was using Animator, if you know what that is, Animator, to make 3D work. Said, I kind of decided, well, why don't I make a 3D game? And back in those days, I kind of vaguely knew coding. I knew a little bit of like GML, which is Game Maker's proprietary language, but I didn't really know how to code grand schemes. So I ended up settling in Unreal Development Kit. I don't even remember the reason why. I tried out Unity and a couple of other ones, but Unreal is just what worked out best for me. Because I didn't know coding and Unreal had its own proprietary scripting language back in those days, Unreal Script, I wasn't gonna that, fuck that. So I tried making the game using entirely Kismet, which is kind of like blueprints that you see in Unreal Engine 4 and 5, but very, very, very basic. It was never something that you were intended to like actually program a game with. It was if you want to make like a light flicker or a trigger that opens a door when you walk up to it or shit like that. It's not something used to program actual mechanics with. And that's kind of what came around and bit me in the ass. Because what I had here is basically just a really shitty haunted house sim. Now, credit where credit's due, I actually think I did a pretty good job with the sound design of this game. It actually sounds nice and creepy, pretty atmospheric. That's one thing that going back and playing it I wasn't really expecting, because other than that, it is entirely garbage. It is not scary. The only gameplay is QuickTime events. I couldn't figure out how to program an enemy, anything like that. All I could figure out how to do with Kismet is QuickTime events. So that's your gameplay. I think like 3 QuickTime events. The whole game is 5, maybe 10 minutes long if you really waste a lot of time. And I'd like hit the limit of what I could code. It was just such an enormous spaghetti mess. There's no way I could keep going, adding any more content to the game. It became very obvious to me that that project was not going to go anywhere. There was no way that I was going to actually make anything worth playing or worth even showing to people. So anyways, after a few weeks of working on that, I gave up on it. I moved on and I stopped thinking about game development for quite a while. Time goes on. I kind of fall out of game development completely, and the next idea I had was some other haunted house bullshit. It was based on some folklore or urban legend. I don't even remember what. But again, I got maybe a week into it, if that, and it just wasn't going anywhere. I was struggling with performance issues. I didn't know how to program anything. It was a mess. I had no good ideas for what I was going to do with the game or the gameplay, and it was probably going to be another garbage 5 to 10 minute haunted house walking simulator. So once again, I said, screw that. But then I had an idea that had a little bit more value. I wanted to make more of a survival horror game, something kind of Resident Evil inspired. So that's when this project really started taking shape and started to resemble what you see today. So at that point, I actually wanted to make a game with fixed camera angles, sort of like old Resident Evil. It was really easy to set up, but really quickly I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do. Because I'd put together a few test levels, nothing too crazy, but just getting a feel for it. And I realized while I could technically do fixed cameras, I could make it functional, I couldn't make it good. Because here's the thing with fixed cameras. It's cinematography. Literally, it's lining up, staging a shot, setting up all the lighting. It's cinematography. And I'm not good at that. And I think that's an aspect of it that a lot of people miss. So there's a good handful of indie games that use those sort of classic fixed camera angles, and one big thing is no one really takes advantage of it. Because there's more to it than just throwing a camera up in the corner of the room so you can see where you're walking. The reason it works so well in old Resident Evil games is because they really knew how to take advantage of it, how to line up and stage these shots in such a way to really evoke a certain emotion or feeling from the player. And it's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of experience with that kind of thing. So something like the Resident Evil 1 remake, which is kind of the swan song of classic survival horror, does this brilliantly. It uses those camera angles to amazing effect to really evoke a lot of fear and tension, and that's just not something I was able to do with it. Because fixed camera angles come with a lot of limitations. There's tons of things that you can't do if that's what you're doing for the gameplay. But the trade-off is, if you are good with that kind of thing, if you are a cinematographer or whatever, then you could really do some amazing things. But I wasn't, so I was getting all the drawbacks with none of the rewards for it. So that's when I made the change back to first person. Because as much as I want to make kind of a Resident Evil inspired game, I'm not just trying to copy Resident Evil. I'm not just trying to do what they do without understanding why. I want to make something that stands on its own merits, something that's good, something that understands what those old games did, what they used to create that fear, and does the same thing, that doesn't just copy what they do for the sake of copying it. But I might have gotten a little bit too carried away with this philosophy of not copying things that have already been done. Because for a very long time with this project, I was just doing the asshole shuffle, bouncing back and forth between ideas. I would think of something that I think is cool, that's scary, that works well, but then I realized, oh wait, I've seen this done before. I've seen it done in a game. I've seen a movie that has a similar plot point. I've read a fucking book that has a similar event happen. That's not original, so screw that. It's out of the game. And every idea I'd think of, I would say, yeah, this is a good idea. I'd start putting it together, adding it into this story, and then realizing after, wait, I've seen it before, back to the drawing board. So I hit a wall, basically. And that's where progress kind of ground to a halt for a pretty good long while. But eventually, I realized something. There really is no such thing as originality. Well, what does that mean? So if you break a story down into its individual elements, to all the smallest pieces that are put together to make it what it is, none of it's original. It's all been done before somewhere. And this is nothing new either. That's how it's always been for creativity. You look back all the way to fucking Shakespeare plays, and basically everything he does and knows has been done before somewhere else. It's not about original ideas. It's about getting all these existing things and putting them together in a way that's new and original. So there's a bunch of different quotes from a bunch of different people about this kind of thing. I don't remember where any of them come from, but stuff like bad artists copy, great artists steal. And I think it was Sam Raimi who said, steal from the best, but make it your own. And once I got to grips with that, that's when the story and the universe and everything really started coming together. Because something about me is I'm not necessarily a huge gamer. I know I'm making a game right now, but I grew up playing a lot of games, and then I kind of fell out of it when I got in my early teens and the latter half of the Xbox 360, PS3 generation as you moved into like Xbox One and PS4, and I figured I just kind of grew out of it. And I've been getting it back into it lately, but I'd say more than a gamer, I'm a big fan of like movies and other forms of horror media. I'm a huge horror fan. And one of the big ideas I had with this game pretty early on is the numbers station. And I remember watching a movie a little while after coming up with that idea. What was it called? The Banshee Chapter. I don't remember too much about the movie. I remember it was fun, definitely no masterpiece, but I was fucking seething the whole time I watched that movie. Because fuck, I wanted to do a numbers station in this. But someone's already done it. Someone's already made a piece of horror media heavily featuring a numbers station. So I can't do it now. And it wasn't until later that I realized, well, everything else in the story is completely different between these two things, except for the existence of a numbers station. And so just because they did it doesn't mean that I can't. But after I kind of had this realization about creativity and all that, I was able to take a step back and say, okay, well, just because they did it, that doesn't mean I can't. But why don't I look at what they did with it and take some notes? What worked? What didn't? What would I change? Now having this sort of hindsight, seeing it done before, seeing someone else do something kind of vaguely similar with it, what can I learn from what they did to make my version even better? And that kind of spiraled out to the rest of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit more detailed about the story of the previous version of this game, the 2019 one, the realistic graphics one, because it's very, very similar to the story that's in the current in-progress version. A lot of the broad strokes are the same, but the details are very different. Take a step back, squint, it's the same story. Step closer, open your eyes up, very, very different. So it's a good way of talking about the story without directly spoiling anything. So first things first, the Revanchist actually takes place in an alternate universe. Not very important anymore, and even in previous versions, this isn't something that I was ever going to explain directly in-game in too much detail. But the gist of it, the really simplified version, is back in the 1970s, 1973 with the oil crisis, that never gets resolved. It ends up just growing and escalating into a third world war, basically, which ends up waging all throughout the rest of the century. Sort of bounces back and forth between a hot war, cold war, different people are fighting different people, but it never really ends and keeps going. And the reason this was important, and the reason it's not very important anymore, is the game was post-apocalyptic. That's right, for the 10 people who stumbled on the old Facebook page that I made, you're not going crazy, that was what I was doing. Also, the art style was very based on like late 70s, early 80s technology and design and everything. You can see a little bit of that in the title screen for the old version of the game. And this is all kind of a case of the art style really informing a lot of the other parts of the game. When I started working on this newest version, I started making these kind of like PS1 inspired graphics, and doing that, it kind of felt natural to make it more 90s themed instead of the late 70s, early 80s. And then in doing that, I said, you know what, why don't I kind of lean into this classic survival horror, Resident Evil, whatever influence a little bit more? Why don't I throw away a lot of the fluff that I had before, the whole post-apocalyptic thing and whatever, that's all gone now. And so the game does still take place in the same universe, just a little bit earlier. I forget what the actual dates are for everything, but I think early 2010s is when the world ended. And so the idea with the original is, it's all retro technology because everyone was focused on the war effort and they didn't develop like consumer technology and whatever. And the game would have taken place at around 2020 or so, just shortly after the apocalypse. Now I'm keeping a lot of those same ideas, but 90s style technology, same thing. It developed a little bit slower because the game actually takes place in 2000 and I don't know, let's say 2008. That's canon now. 2008. So before the apocalypse, yeah. I don't know. Either way, one of the most important aspects of this story is the company. Working title's TKI. I don't actually have a final name for the company. I might just leave it at TKI at this point. Either way, it's a tech company. Back in the 70s, they did like alternative energy bullshit. With the energy crisis and the war and everything breaking out, they ended up securing some government contracts, got a lot of money out of it, and then started expanding from there. By the time the game takes place, they've got their fingers in a lot of pies. They do a whole bunch of different things, but the big three for them are energy, propulsion, like jet engines and rockets, shit like that, and weapons. And in those three, they've basically got a monopoly. They work very closely with the government. They get all the contracts, tons of money. It's a very big, powerful company to the point that they built an entire city to run their company out of. That's their headquarters where they do their research, manufacturing, whatever. And now I know what you're thinking. Geez, Travis, this is sounding mighty familiar. I feel like I've heard of this somewhere before. Maybe seen something just like this. Yes, I know. It's not what you think. And that was one of the nice parts of kind of owning the inspirations for this, right? Of really saying, yeah, you know what? I don't have to make every individual piece of this game totally original. I can do things that are done before as long as I do something new with them. I'm not going to be talking about exactly how this all works, but it isn't what you think. No, but just give me a chance to really play with people's expectations a little bit. Because let's be real. I say the game is Resident Evil inspired. I introduce you to some big, powerful company that does some shady everything. I don't think I've got to say anything more. I don't think I've got to show anything more. We don't have to go anywhere in the game for you to start putting together, I wonder if there's gonna be monsters. I wonder if there's gonna be an underground lab. I wonder where those monsters are coming from. And so now, because I haven't been so scared of running away from, oh, it's too similar to Resident Evil, I could sort of lean into that, play with those expectations, and then have things play out a little bit differently from what you might think. Which is good because horror is a lot scarier when you're not expecting it. And that is going to be a big thing in the Revanchist. So I've toned that aspect down a lot in this newer version. But in the older one, that was going to be the whole focus of the game. So actually, I wasn't even planning on selling it as a horror game. It was going to definitely have horror inspirations and everything, but it wouldn't start off as a horror game, and that's not really how I would have promoted it to be. So the story of the original, which is again very similar to the story of the new one in some sort of abstract ways, was you were living in some nice little post-apocalyptic community somewhere, just out in the woods. You had your nice little shack that you were in and whatever. It was almost like a post-apocalypse. People had like rebuilt pretty well and you were chilling, you were vibing. It was just like a nice little rural town out in the woods, basically. So you muck around there for a few minutes, just wasting some time, and then, oh no, some guys attack and they kidnap your wife and kidnap you. You end up waking up in some dingy basement, jail cell, whatever, somewhere. There's another guy in the cell with you who's freaking out, panicking, and an armed guard in the hallway. So the guy who's panicking, and he's like, oh my god, let me out of here. He's like sticking his arms through the bars, and the armed guard's like, hey, back the fuck up. Keep your arms inside the cell. And then you hear these big, heavy, thumping footsteps in the distance, coming down the stairs into this dingy basement jail area, whatever it is. He walks through the door, and it's this guy in like this big suit of fucking power armor or whatever. If you saw the helmet that I posted at the end of my last video, that would be part of that. So right before he gets to the room, lights cut out, alarm starts blaring, these red emergency lights start flashing. Guy who's in the cell with you starts panicking again, starts reaching through the bars. Hey, what's going on? Let me out! Guy in the power armor walks into the room, sees him out there at the bars, reaching his arm out, grabs his arm, rips it off in one swipe, one move, throws it against the wall. Guy falls down, he's got like the bones in his forearm sticking out, maybe little bits of flesh dangling off, and he's just rolling around screaming. And big power armor guy just keeps walking without even paying any mind. Arm guard comes in, shoots the guy. So power armor guy just keeps walking, goes through this like big, heavy armored door at the end of the hallway. Then the guard turns to you, he's like, come with me, and you follow him, fade to black. So the camera fades back in, presumably a few minutes later, you're out in the middle of the forest, still being escorted by this armed guard. He says, okay, this is far enough. You turn around, assuming he's gonna like execute you or something. He pulls this sort of like Polaroid-ass camera out of his pocket, takes a picture of himself, looks at the photo that printed off, tosses it away, just kind of blows away in the wind, puts his gun to his chin and pulls the trigger. So now you're just out there in the forest. What the fuck is that? What was that? What just happened? You pick up his camera and his gun and you get moving. So yeah, I'm not a writer. Obviously, if you couldn't tell from hearing that intro to the game, yes, I am not a writer. And everything that I just told you is gone. That none of that is going to be in any way, shape, or form in this game. That's all completely separate. What is going to start overlapping is everything that happens after that, in some way, shape, or form. So in the original, you're now out in the forest. You could see sort of up on a hill in the distance, this sort of big facility. It's some sort of like warehouse or something. That's where you came from. That's where they had you. You're in the basement of that. And at this point, you're going to be loose exploring the forest. And you weren't actually going to be fighting monsters or creatures or whatever. It wasn't going to be a survival horror game at that point. It was actually going to be sort of a... So one thing is I kind of wanted to go out of my way in that version to play up the violence and whatever of the intro. I wanted it to be very brutal, very gory, the guys just like screaming in agony, rolling around, because I wanted to make sure that the people who play this are a horror audience, because it wasn't really going to start as a horror game. It was going to be sort of a tense action thriller, very tactical. You were going to be facing off against mostly human enemies in the beginning, sort of making your way through the forest, solving puzzles, unlocking buildings. You're going to be facing off against human enemies. They were part of that group of whatever people who kidnapped you. I wanted to design the combat to be very tense and suspenseful. It was going to be very focused around either ambushes or building combat. It's either you gotta like kind of sneak up on people and take them by surprise, or maybe they're sneaking up on you to take you by surprise, or one of you is locked down in a building, either you or them, and the other one's gotta kind of make their way in and try to push through and whatever. And the idea is I kind of wanted to make a horror-esque action game. Something where you're fighting against people with like guns and knives and shit, but kind of appeals more to a horror audience. And that's because the campaign was actually going to start splitting off and branch off into 2 separate playthroughs. And this is something that's staying in the Revanchist in some way, shape, or form at least. And so this is staying in this version of the project. And not only that, it's already in it. In the prototype build that I'm going to be playtesting soon, I've already started this. The basic functionality's already been programmed. There's actually already a couple of points where things will branch off in one way or another depending on how you've played. And the way it's set up between both games is basically going to be the same idea at least, where you kind of have 2 choices. So you're just trying to get out of there and survive, or are you trying to dig deeper and figure out what's going on? So I'll just call those, let's just say scenario A and B. The A playthrough is just the I'm trying to get out of here. The B playthrough is I want to find what I'm looking for. I want to push further into this. And so in the original game, the A scenario, the A playthrough would have been, I got to escape. I got to get the fuck out of this forest. I got to get away from these people. And then the B playthrough would be you saying, I got to go back and get my wife out of there. Remember, they kidnapped her too. And there's never going to be a moment where you just have a choice. Text pops up on the screen. Oh, do you want to A, run away or go find her? It's just naturally through gameplay. What are you doing? Are you finding keys and solving puzzles that are taking you closer and closer to the warehouse, getting back to where you started there? Or are you solving puzzles to, I don't know, fix up a fucking car or something that you could drive on out of there to escape? I don't know what I was going to do for that route of the game. But basically, if you're just kind of following the path, moving forward, doing the bare minimum, you're trying to escape. In that case, you would have just been fighting the human enemies. And again, I wanted to keep the encounters tense, suspenseful, but not explicitly horror. And then the final boss would have been Mr. Power Armor Guy, whatever. He would have been kind of a stalker enemy who appears throughout the game, but he's basically bulletproof. You can't do shit about him until the end. And that's how that would have played out. But again, things are a lot scarier when they're unexpected. The scariest forms of horror to me are things that weren't originally horror, or weren't originally presented as horror at least. And that's kind of what I was trying to do with that. Where as you start digging deeper, if you're trying to make your way back to the warehouse, you're solving those puzzles, it's gonna start shifting into a horror game. There's gonna be some supernatural happenings. Ooh. You're gonna hear some strange noises off in the distance. Things are gonna go bump in the night. And eventually you get introduced to the creatures, the monsters, the whatever you want to call it. And I remember the way I wanted to introduce these is a little bit before you get to that warehouse, before you arrive there, you'll encounter the Power Armor Guy, whatever, who up until this point is built up as like the most powerful thing around, right? You know, at the beginning, he rips the guy's arm off, no hesitation, doesn't take any effort, just done. Then you've encountered him a bunch since then. You've probably figured out he's bulletproof. He's this indestructible, all-powerful thing. So you encounter him, you maybe run away for a bit, you get cornered. But then you hear something in the distance. The guy instantly drops focus from you. He knows what made that sound. And between that and you are not the priority. You don't matter. Then the creature busts in through the wall. If you've seen the concept art for the one with all the teeth, it's that one. So Power Armor Guy's got his own gun, he starts shooting it, and the bullets, they're pinging off of it, right? You get a little blood splatter, but there's also like the big flash of sparks and that sort of ping of metal hitting metal. It's bulletproof too. And so it just barrels into him, tackles him down like an NFL player tackling a 4-year-old, and just absolutely mauls him. So now it's like, oh fuck. This guy's basically like fucking Frank Horrigan. He's built up this whole time to be the final boss. He's indestructible, and he's just got his shit pushed in by this thing. And that's sort of the moment where things would shift. Now the human enemies, they don't matter anymore. Those are not the problem. Those are not what you gotta worry about anymore. Now is where it actually turns into a horror. And my idea, my hope behind this, is that by making the game up until this point sort of excessively brutal and violent or whatever, making the combat really tense and high stakes, and giving it the kind of old Resident Evil survival horror item management, very limited resources, all that I would attract kind of a horror audience who doesn't necessarily expect this to be a horror game. And now they're caught off guard because it suddenly is. So then you'd make your way up to the warehouse, you'd go to the basement, you see the cells that they were keeping you in, and you see that door, that big, heavily armored door that we went through at the beginning. So when the alarms were blaring and the sirens were going off, Now it's your chance to go through and see what's in there. And that takes you to these underground labs and a bunch of stuff that I am not gonna spoil because it is staying the same. So now, on the current version, what's changed? So now what's changed? Honestly, almost everything. But also, not as much as you might think. So if you've been paying any attention at all, you should know I've dropped a lot of that. The whole human enemies and exploring around the forest trying to escape and all that, that's all gone. All of that stuff with the company being a mystery and not knowing anything about the underground facility and whatever, that's also all gone. And the big reasons for that is with this version, I really wanted to focus in on making just sort of a core survival horror experience. Really taking a step back and thinking about what made those old survival horror games, again, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, things like that, so special that you really just don't get nowadays. So the company's not a mystery. That's one of the biggest changes between the original towards the current version. So you play as John Revanchist. Not actually, but his name is actually John. You live in the company-run city and work for TKI. And so does your wife, Casey. So John is a pencil pusher, does some boring desk job, logistics, but he's got pretty high standings in the company and works with a lot of their sort of classified projects. From like experimental nuclear rocket engines and bullshit to chemical weapons and all sorts of shady, underhanded things like that he's already aware of. And Casey is a researcher, working at one of the company's R&D facilities, also doing a bunch of classified things. Things that are above John's pay grade though, and he isn't allowed to know about. 7 months before the game, she disappears suddenly. Completely out of nowhere, just one day she never shows up home from work. So John obviously brings this to the police, and they are less than enthusiastic to investigate. Given that the town was built and is entirely operated by TKI, John sees this as a little bit suspicious. Bear in mind he already knows they do lots of under-the-table things that the public does not know about, so he's got a pretty solid hunch that they might be involved. The case never makes the news, it's never reported on TV, in the newspaper, anything like that. But he starts running his own investigation, looking into this as best as he can. This is not a huge city, however, and it doesn't take very long for John to meet up with other people who are in similar situations. People who have had friends and family members disappear just like Casey. Not only that, but they find out everyone vanished on the exact same day. So John and this group of people start working together and collaborating on this investigation, all of them looking into it, figuring out whatever they can. Eventually, they piece together that on that day, just over 24 people vanished. They end up discovering a peculiar numbers station. Now, given that the game takes place at wartime and they're in a city that's run by this big shady organization that does all sorts of under-the-table things, this is nothing new in and of itself. It's just a means of sort of encoded communications. They're fairly common to see pop up and disappear every now and then. But after a while, they start to notice that this one never really goes away. Sometimes it'll stick around for a day or two before going down, sometimes only an hour. But it never really vanishes. It just changes frequencies. And not just changes frequencies, but even completely different formats. Sometimes it'll be on AM radio, sometimes they could find it on FM, sometimes shortwave, sometimes they could even pick it up on UHF or VHF TV broadcasts. So, feeling like this might have something to do with what's going on, they start looking into this station. They're not able to dig up much. Even members of this group who are pretty high-ranking in the company and are generally privy to this kind of thing have never heard of this station before. They also can't figure out where it's coming from. Every time the frequency jumps, the signal strength varies wildly and seems to be being broadcast from completely different locations. Before long, the group comes in contact with one of the heads of the communications department in the company. According to him, the company is aware of these broadcasts. And so he's very unsure of what the company's involvement is with the station, if there is any at all, but what he does know is the company is running an operation to track the station, to basically chase it around from frequency to frequency and run destructive interference, basically noise cancelling to block it out, with the official reasoning behind this being to prevent collisions. You know, to stop it from interfering with any of their existing broadcasts or communications. So over the course of several months, this investigation starts to fall off. However deep they start digging, whatever information they're able to find, it never really leads anywhere, and over the course of several months, they haven't really made any progress in figuring out what happened to these people. And TKI is also not exactly thrilled about people poking around in all these different classified operations. And over time, it becomes increasingly common for people involved in the investigation to be met with some sort of vague threats from the company, because remember, the company is doing a lot of shady, underhanded things with the government, stuff like chemical weapons, things that they really don't want people poking their nose around. So there's been several occasions where people involved in this have had someone show up on their door in a black suit and basically tell them, mind your own business or else. So by the time the game takes place, John is one of the only people left still actively investigating what happened. So something to be aware of is TKI is obviously a very large and powerful company, and they basically have a monopoly on a lot of very lucrative wartime industries and pretty much have the government in their pocket. But that's not to say that they don't have competitors, and that there's no one else out there who wants a slice of that pie. And in fact, there's a lot of companies out there who will go to great lengths to try to steal whatever information they can from TKI. Whether that's research data and technical specifications so they can steal TKI's technology, or to find proof of TKI's dirty dealings and war crimes, to basically smear them to the public so the government kinda has to take a step back for public relations' sake. This was actually a big motivating factor in TKI's decision to centralize their operations to this one city, to help stop any sensitive information from leaking. So not long before the game, John is contacted by one of these rival companies. This company is just as interested in what happened to those people as John is, and they make him a very tempting offer. Work for them and feed them any information from TKI that he can get his hands on, and they'll use their resources to comb through the data, investigate this themselves, and see if they can make a connection between TKI and what happened. And whatever they're able to find out, they'll not only give back to him, but they'll also ensure that anything they can dig up will find its way into the hands of the general public. And that brings us to the start of the game. So that's the setup. It's a lot of information, and frankly, I really don't plan on explaining it all. So I've said it before, I'll say it again, I'm not a writer. So I'm gonna have like a couple of notes, maybe a short cutscene or two, enough to give the player enough pieces to put together that they can kind of construct the backstory themselves, but I'm not gonna sit there and have some big exposition dump or bullshit like that. Because let's be real, no one cares. I'm under no delusion that people are gonna think that this is some amazing, gripping story, that they've gotta hear all of these details. No. I want to have a complete, fleshed out universe to set this in. I want all of the information to be there so that I can reference it and talk about it and be consistent with it. But I don't want to sit there and just over-explain it. And frankly, even if I wanted to, I don't have the skill to. There's no way that I could introduce all of this information to someone in the beginning of the game and have it not be a miserable slog. So I'm just going to drip feed little bits and pieces. And that's kind of my philosophy for everything in the game. So from old versions of this product, I've got literally like 100+ pages of design documents and lore and story and history and all this shit. None of it's making, almost none of it at least, especially in the new version. I've heard the phrase, and I can't remember where I heard it from, but small window into a larger world. That's what I want to do here. I want to have the whole universe, everything set, so there's a consistent, fleshed out backdrop, and then you just kind of get bits and pieces of it as you go. And one of the reasons I haven't really done any of this yet, I haven't actually added any of the story into the game, is partially because it's just not that important at this stage in development, but also because I don't want to commit to any. What I would love to do at some point, may or may not end up happening, but ideally, before I start getting too hard into the story on this game, is actually consult with a writer. Someone who actually knows a thing or two about telling a compelling story, and sort of run some ideas past them, see the best ways to kind of handle and present a lot of these things. But in general, I just don't think it's really that important for the game, especially not this version. With the old one, you know, post-apocalyptic, all this, it kind of helps to have an explanation of why. Why is this some post-apocalyptic wasteland? Why is it all 70s and 80s technology? You know, I want there to be the answers somewhere for that. But in this version, I think I'm far better off having people just think, okay, well, it's set in the 1990s, real world, whatever, then sit there and shove all this ham-fisted explanation down people's neck. Oh, actually, it's set in 2008, and the technology is just slightly stunted because there's a war going on, and blah, 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 bullshit. So that lore is all still there. If someone wants to read into it to that level and really analyze things and connects all the dots and whatever, there is that kind of reward for them where they can figure out this larger universe and history of events and all this stuff. But it doesn't actually matter. If someone's not going to, it's not going to affect anything. It's not going to detract from the experience. So as far as the actual events of the game, I'm not going to be going too deep into this just because, well, I don't want to spoil it, and also I'm still bouncing around ideas, but it's also just kind of continuously changing as I go. My thoughts on it are basically, I've got the universe, I've got the history, I've got all that pretty much set in stone. It is what it is. Then I'm going to build this sort of classic style survival horror game on that foundation, and then the actual plot of the game is just going to kind of be built up around the game. Because at least for me, what I really remember, what really resonates with me with those survival horror classics is the environments, the gameplay, the sort of lore and backstory of it, but definitely not the plot of the game, if I'm going to be honest with you. But either way, the way I'm planning on the game starting is you start in the house, there's going to be a little bit of a story section at the beginning. I don't want it to be longer than maybe about 10 minutes. You're going to start at the house, then you're going to go into work, wherever that ends up being, and have a quick talk with another character, Ben. So Ben is one of your coworkers. He's also secretly working for this other rival company as well. So the idea is that John already knows Ben, but they didn't know that they were both working for this other company as well until now. You find out that Ben's just doing it for money. He's not part of this, original investigation or anything. But basically, you guys just kind of talk about the plan for later. So basically, through some leaked documents, this rival company has found the location of TKI's R&D 3. It's not like an actual research and development lab or anything like that. It's just sort of an ancillary warehouse storage site. Effectively just like a small shed that they would dump old projects in that they don't want to throw out yet. So according to leaked documents, it was abandoned about a month after all the disappearances. So according to the documents, they left it pretty suddenly and there's no continued presence there at all. There's no security, anything like that. It is abandoned. So because TKI completely just washed their hands and walked away from it, they're not expecting to find much there. But either way, that evening, John is going to go out there to meet up with Ben and a third person, Sarah, and they're basically just going to go paw through it, see if they could find any old computers to scrape some data off of. Maybe someone left a notebook tucked behind a shelf somewhere or something. Basically just see if they could find any information that'll point them in the right direction. And as you could probably tell if you've watched my previous videos, one thing leads to another and you end up trapped in some underground whatever it is. So much like my plans for the previous version of this game, I'm envisioning two different playthroughs. So basically it just comes down to, are you trying to escape and get out of there? Or are you trying to dig deeper and figure out what happened? So in the original version of this game, that basically would have been two totally separate campaigns. My thought would be that it would branch off somewhere around halfway through the game, and it would basically be two completely separate campaigns from that point on, fighting different enemies in different locations with totally separate things going on each way. But one of the big things I'm focusing on with this version of the project is making sure it's realistic. I'm one guy, and I don't have a ton of experience. Doing it that way would basically give me 50% more game that I have to make for one game, if that makes any sense. Plus, I don't think it would be ideal to play. The fact that the first half of the story is identical either way means if you want to do one story than the other, if you want to experience both of them, well, guess what? You're going to have to play through the first half of the game exactly the same either way. Tough shit. So in the new version of this game, you're never going to hit like a straight up fork in the road where it's you're going this way or that way, one or the other. It'll branch off at a few points and then merge back in before long. So it's going to be kind of two different versions of the same campaign. Depending on how you play it, things are going to play out differently. You might have access to some new different areas, but it's not going to be two completely separate campaigns like it would have been original. But I still want to use it to play into that kind of fear of the unexpected. Things are way scarier when you don't know they're coming. So whereas in the original that meant throwing an intense horror game into what was previously a kind of action thriller, now the way it's going to be is kind of the standard A campaign, just going through the motions, trying to get out of there, is going to be more of your traditional Resident Evil style experience. And then the B playthrough is going to be where things get a lot more interesting. That's where you're going to get a lot of the more deeper lore of things. That's where you're going to be able to piece together what's actually happening. And that's also where I'm going to be breaking out some of the more interesting, experimental, unique gameplay mechanics. So I know you hear me talk about Resident Evil a lot when I'm talking about this game. I open pretty much every video by saying, hey, I'm making a Resident Evil inspired game. But there's definitely a lot more to it than that. Because there's a lot more inspirations that have gone into this than just Resident Evil, Silent Hill, things like that. Something that I've never really talked about, just because it hasn't been relevant in the videos, is the non-game inspirations for this. Because believe it or not, I, sitting here talking to you on this game development channel, making a game that is very heavily inspired by other games that I'm very passionate about, am not the biggest gamer in the world. I grew up playing tons of video games, absolutely loved them. Around 2012 or so, I started Fallout. And so throughout the 2010s, I didn't really play much games at all. I did some modding for Fallout New Vegas, I was pretty big in that community, but around the time Fallout 4 came out, I just kind of fell out of it. I didn't give a fuck anymore. So one thing that I think is going to be pretty apparent when you're actually playing the game is I'm really big into horror movies. In general, I've been pretty conscious about avoiding any direct references to anything in the game, movies, games, otherwise, just because I want to keep it kind of focused, immersive, whatever. But I think it is going to be pretty apparent in a lot of the ways that things are framed and staged and timed and whatever, that there's a very strong film inspiration behind a lot of it. And then when you look even deeper than that, you're going to see actually a lot of horror literature reflected in the backstory and lore and everything around it. So you've heard a million times by now, heavily inspired by Resident Evil, Silent Hill, a little bit of Fatal Frame, and even a pinch of Dead Space is going to find its way in there eventually. So then as far as movies are concerned, ones that have had a particularly large part in shaping the game are, of course, as I mentioned before, the Banshee chapter, also The Void, Annihilation, little bit of Cabin in the Woods, but in particular, Aterrados, or Terrified, not Terrifier, different movie. Terrified in particular has had a huge part in shaping a lot of what's gone into this game. It's one of the only movies in recent memory since I was a kid that's actually scared me in any way, and if you're a horror fan and you don't mind reading subtitles, honestly go check it out, it's fantastic, and The Revanchist borrows quite a lot from it. Additionally, Where Evil Lurks, another film by the same director, that's another one that's been a huge inspiration for this version of the game. It hasn't affected the story in any meaningful way, but it has had a huge impact on the way I present the story, the way it's going to be talked about in-game. But beyond that, there's 4 written works in particular that have gone on to be huge inspiration behind the story and lore of The Revanchist. Shit that I'm not going to talk about or spoil yet, but if you want a bit of a sneak peek, listen up now. The Rats in the Walls, The Jaunt, Enigma of Amigara Fault, and House of Leaves have all been equally big inspirations for the story behind The Revanchist. Okay, sorry for the abrupt cut. It is now tomorrow. So I was just running way too long. The raw recording is like 2 hours long. I'm going to be cutting out most of that. And it's just incoherent rambling. I really don't even want to post this. Just sunk cost fallacy at this point. Either way, onto the topic of playtesting. So I've got a Discord set up, I think, I don't exactly know, I don't use Discord, I'm a tech illiterate boomer, but I'm pretty sure it's set up and running. So if you want to give the game a try, help out with playtesting, that is going to be the place to do it, link in the description. So I am going to be pacing myself with the playtesting. It's important to be able to get people's first impressions, and I don't want to burn through the entire pool of people all at once. But regardless, I am looking to start playtesting pretty much right away. And don't get me wrong, the game is still in a pretty rough state. There are a lot of features and content that are still unfinished, and there's also a lot of things that are still placeholder, but I am at a point where I want to start getting some direct feedback so I know what direction to move the thing. So yeah, if you want to give it a try, be part of the development process, make sure you pop on down to that Discord, or even if you don't want to actually playtest it, you just want to be part of the discussion, anything like that, feel free to join in. And also, make sure you wishlist it on Steam. Yes, you. So yeah, I'm sorry you had to sit through this video, unless you skipped ahead to here, in which case, good choice. But either way, as always, thank you very much, and have a fantastic rest of your day.